I am presently aged 45 and took LSD at age 16. I can honestly say that the trip experience was so profound and real that it has affected me ever since. My parents were on holiday and I tripped at home with a work colleague who was not a good friend, just somebody I knew. I thought LSD was going to be all flowers and pretty lights, etc., and was looking forward to the experience. We bought the black microdot tabs from a dealer that he knew, who warned us that the tabs were strong and to make sure we were somewhere safe. On the way home on a bus, we dropped the tabs. We got home okay and decided to go to a local shop. The time was around 5 to 6 p.m. After about half an hour, we started to feel a bit lightheaded and giggly. We returned home and sat in the front room and put on some Deep Purple on the hi-fi. I can remember moving my hands and seeing the fingertips trailing behind, and also seeing the walls swaying. Also, sounds coming out of the hi-fi speakers were in color. Then, bang. I lost an hour or two here. My colleague said that I just wandered round and round in circles in a trance state. I can vaguely remember seeing my mind on different planes and levels, shooting out into infinity. I then came round and noticed the guy with me staring at me in an all-knowing way. He had tripped before, and I began to get the awful feeling that he had tricked me into taking the tab. As time went on, I began to get paranoid and started to realize that this trip was going to last for eternity, and, in fact, my whole life previous to this was also part of the trip. I saw my parents sitting on the sofa laughing at me. I looked at the guy with me. Yes, I now realized I knew him. I'd always known him, for eternity. I was in a death trip now. I was sucked into a spiral. Everything I looked at, I knew what was coming. Deja vu on a massive scale. Fear is not a good description of the horror of this experience. Several times in the trip, I became aware and tried to tell myself, "This is stupid. You are you." I repeated my name over and over. At one stage, I decided to go for a walk. It was dark, about 11 p.m. We caught a bus, God knows how, walked around a town center. It was raining. The rain hit my face and felt like acid burning holes. I looked at the guy with me. Yes, his name, everything. He was the bastard that always tricks me into taking LSD, and I fall for it every time, for infinity. Whoosh, away again down the deja vu spiral. Horrendous, sickening fear. At one stage in town, I looked at an exit sign. Yes, exit. This is it. It is the trip. Whoosh, away again. Managed to get home safely by walking home. We had left the front door unlocked, but got lucky. I then spent the next 2 to 3 hours battling with my sanity, as time and time again I suffered the realization and gut-wrenching fear that I had done this millions of times before and could never escape it. I eventually came down at about 4 a.m., staring at a gas fire in a state of shock. The following days I wandered around in a confused state, trying to come to terms with what had happened to me. I only took LSD one more time after that, a half a tab, to convince myself it was okay. It wasn't. I went to a rock concert at a stadium. It was dark. I saw the exit signs. I was back on the same trip. I panicked, left early, and went home, and I laid in my bed in a state of fear. The following year I smoked some weed, became paranoid, and suddenly flashbacked. I was still on the trip. I ran panicking. It's all I could do for a few seconds. Then, the feeling goes. I tried sniffing solvent. Bang, whilst high. I got the same feeling, still on the trip, panicked and ran again. People look at me strange. I'm not surprised. The years went on though. I married and had children, and got a good job. Whilst at work, I had to go into a dark hall with an illuminated exit sign. Bang, you've guessed it. I flashbacked again. Deja vu. The people with me are all part of the conspiracy, and as it goes on, I've had about 7 or 8 flashbacks, some being as far as 8 years apart. The last one I had was last week. I was in a panicky situation involving my job, involving danger. I was dealing with something when I had the realization, deja vu feeling again. Oh no, is what I say. Christ, it's a nightmare. So during my life, I've tried TM, Buddhism, martial arts, various other spiritual paths. I'm lost. I'm searching for sanity. I honestly don't know. 29 years later, what is reality? When I die, I hope it's blackness and peace, and not part of a never-ending trip, and having to suffer the experience again. My advice to anybody reading this who hasn't tripped yet, don't. DXM was my first drug. I guess its legality and ability to produce hallucinations are what made me want to try it. It was easily accessible. At my young age, other drugs were actually hard to come by, and those that were around didn't sound fun. So my first trip, I hit the second plateau. The morning after, I wrote, 9:27. Woke up confused with still affected vision and sense of gravity. Still partial numbness and flanging of image. Must have fallen asleep on my trip. I thought this might have happened. I am glad, however, that I did not throw up, as most of the users of this drug report. I am not tired and there is still a lot of flanging. My vocal skills haven't completely returned, teeth still chattering very slightly. Weird drug. I will experiment one more time and give it a fighting chance, but it won't be for at least a week, and I'll make better preparations for the trip. Although, as I came to discover, those effects did not subside until about 2 days later. I was no longer tripping, and my experience didn't really match up with the defective cytochrome. Later that night, when the lights went dim and I should have been sober for at least 12 hours, I looked at my Van Gogh painting. It moved a little. I waved my hand in front of my face, and about 50 copies of my hand formed a trail before my very eyes. I was inexperienced with drugs, so I didn't really know how to handle the situation. Cool, I thought. The visual symptoms eventually reached a level where things were no longer moving on their own. Well, not all the time at least. I had been so intrigued by the first trip though that I tripped again and again. The third time I used DXM, I took 6 Benadryl. The next day, the visual symptoms were just as bad as after DXM. After that, I tripped on DXM alone about 12 times, at second to third plateau doses, spaced 2 to 4 weeks apart. Soon I posted something about this, and RFG told me to stop using drugs completely and seek medical attention. Well, I took a 1-year DXM hiatus and saw a doctor. I saw that the requirements for diagnosis included a lack of explanation by eye problems, so I saw an optometrist. He checked me up and down, administered a lot of tests, and tried to determine the cause of these visual phenomena. At this point I was having floaters, extremely long motion trails. Staring at something for long enough was enough to make it move. My after images stayed long enough for me to navigate a bathroom in the dark after flashing the lights on for a second. My optometrist said my eyes were fine, better than fine even. Same with my optic nerve. So next I saw a neurologist. Although he had never heard of this before, he had an EEG and MRI done, thinking perhaps I had a stroke under the influence of DXM. I thought it was ridiculous and he didn't know what he was talking about, and the test said the same, no stroke. I also went to my psychologist, and they said I had a clean bill of mental health. What could it be? So after a lot of unsuccessful attempts to seek treatment, I begged my physician for Klonopin or some benzos. He said no. I was frustrated with this whole situation and I gave up on doctors for a while. After a year and no improvement of the symptoms, I tried marijuana for the first time. The way I can tell how bad a drug is going to be for my HPPD-like symptoms is how bad they are about 2 hours after I return to baseline. DXM is the worst for it of any drug I've ever used. DXM aggravates my symptoms more than Benadryl, methamphetamine, ecstasy, Ritalin, Adderall, ketamine, ether, marijuana, MDE, opiates, nitrous oxide, and whatever else I may have consumed along the way. Of the preceding list, the worst offender is definitely Adderall. I don't know why, there's no rhyme or reason to it. After I tried pot for the first time, I used DXM twice more. Once third plateau, my final time a fourth. It has been about 2 years since I last used DXM, and I've used a whole host of drugs in between then and now. I know of another person who had these same symptoms up until the point I stopped talking to him. He found the effects rather pleasant and didn't make an effort to change them. I couldn't read books if the paper was too bright. Every time I looked at the sky, I was reminded that my brain is probably altered in an unfavorable way. My night vision was gone. Blind spots were developing. Today, I smoke marijuana daily. The symptoms have become a little easier to ignore. I often go for many days without noticing one symptom, and I will admit that because of this. It cannot be technically counted as HPPD, as it must interfere with my life somehow. All I can say is, it certainly does make me steer clear of acid. So really, what I was trying to say is, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of anecdotal reports about HPPD-like symptoms pop up. After my history of drug use, I feel like I have HPPD. I definitely have visual snow, but I ignore it pretty well. And I was gonna make a deep dive video on it, but I'm not sure. Let me know if you guys want to hear that. Sometimes HPPD can be very life interfering, but for some people like me, I can handle it and I can ignore it. But for other people, it could be a lot harder. Anyways, if you're enjoying this content, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe if you're new. Also, turn on that notification bell so you don't miss any new upload. Thank you, and let's move on to the next story. The experience was a while back, so I don't remember all the details. I know that it was bad, very bad. I was calm when I took the dose under my tongue, laying on my bed. I wasn't looking for a high, I was looking for the kind of spiritual experience I heard Salvia can bring. But I don't recall feeling any kind of high or spiritual feeling during the entire trip. Once the Salvia had completely kicked in, I began to feel disoriented, and eventually, I lost touch with reality. I felt that little evil things were circulating around the outside of my body, attacking me. I ran out of my room at one point and into the bathroom, probably thinking that I could wash them off or something. I then realized that I was tripping. Realizing this didn't help at all, I felt horrible. Very, very afraid, hard to bear. It went away within a few hours. That night I had very strange and vivid dreams. When I woke up, I noticed that I could still see tracers, which I can still see to this day in a milder form. The next day, while at a friend's house after having went on a job, I had the first panic attack of my life. It was horrible. I felt like I was going to die or go crazy. Classic panic attack, as I later learned. I thought it was a fluke, but soon later learned that it was HPPD. For the next few months, I felt like crap. I kept having panic attacks daily, which were very unpleasant, and caused pain in my heart or solar plexus area. When I wasn't having a panic attack, I often felt depressed, and also often felt a strange, very unpleasant, hard to describe feeling that, like the anxiety and depression, was very, very hard to deal with. Also, sometimes when I saw tracers, it actually really hurt, in an emotional way that is hard to describe, to look at them. When I drank caffeine or alcohol, I got anxious and generally felt like crap. I stopped drinking these things and tried thinking positive, praying, meditating, exercising, etc. Nothing worked very much. I've never been a neurotic person, never had psychological problems, but I was a wreck. After a while, I had heard that acupuncture could help HPPD, and I started going to an acupuncturist. Progress was slow, but months and thousands of dollars later, I felt almost normal, with anxiety attacks and the strange feeling in my solar plexus area coming only infrequently. Only years later did I begin to feel basically normal. To this day, though, I avoid caffeine since it makes me anxious, sometimes bringing about panic-like feelings. In case the reader is wondering whether other trips or drug experiences could have contributed to my case of HPPD, I should describe my previous drug history. I had once smoked marijuana fairly regularly, but at the time of the Salvia trip, I hadn't smoked for months. I had tripped on LSD and shrooms a dozen or so times, as recently as 2 or 3 years before, and only one of those times was anything near a bad trip, and that one was 5 or 10 years before the Salvia trip. I had some very mild tracers and other visuals that I sometimes noticed years after these trips, so I suppose this was a very slight case of HPPD, but there were no psychological symptoms like anxiety or paranoia. The full-fledged case of HPPD, with the much increased and painful to look at tracers and all the psychological problems, did not happen until after the Salvia trip, described here. First, let me start this by giving a little background on myself. At the time I am writing this, I am a 19-year-old male with an extensive history of drug use and abuse. I suffer from mild HPPD and have for several years. Occasionally, I see things run around the edges of my vision or have a screen of color over my vision, or see fractal patterns spiral around, etc. Now, Back closer to the present day, about a week ago, I smoked 2 bowls, approximately 2.5 grams total, of my house mix that is a base of cannabis, with a portion of Calea zacatechichi and Amanita muscaria skins. All I can recall of that night is smoking the last of the second bowl, setting my pipe down and picking up my lighter. 3 hours later, I woke up in a construction site about a half a mile from my house. I walked home, trying not to walk in front of traffic, as the lights from oncoming cars was very warm and inviting. After I fell asleep, I had very strange dreams that would take forever to describe here. A few nights later, I went back to the construction site to try and get a handle on the trip and figure out how I ended up there. After sitting on a concrete pipe for over an hour, I was no closer to a breakthrough, so I got up to leave. As I stood up, my head started swimming, and I felt a little drunk. The familiar spiraling fractals started flying across my vision. I tried to sit back down, but missed the pipe that I'd been sitting on and kept falling. I fell backwards onto a new plane of existence. From there, or maybe it's really here, I could see clearly 2 paradigms of reality. In one, everything was a construct of my own mind, created or destroyed at will, my will. In the other, everything was concrete and was a creation of a force beyond myself, stable and unbending. By looking one way, everything was oriented to one vision. By looking another, the second took over. The divergence of perception and the lack of a stable view of reality was starting to make me feel physically sick. I think I vomited once or twice. I tried to fight my way back to what I thought was normal, but I only succeeded in merging the 2 mutually exclusive views of reality into one. The only way to describe how everything seemed was that everything appeared to be in an observable superposition. That was days ago. Everything still seems to be in a state of being indistinguishably concrete and existing as far as a thought. This has shown no signs of abating. I have no idea how long this will last. The only upside of this is that experiencing everything for the first time is so fresh and new, but that quickly wears off. The difference between the paradigms of reality is no longer physically affecting me, but it remains a constant annoyance. I am 17 and I'm afflicted with HPPD. I'm not sure what exactly caused it because I've done a lot of different shit, but I think the main offenders are DXM and Datura. In the past, I had used pot and mushrooms with no adverse effects, although I did eat a few too many shrooms at one time, 8 or more grams. But all that happened was major hallucinations and puking, but afterwards I felt fine. This summer, everything changed. I tried a lot of new drugs. My friend got me to try crack and speed. I love speed, but my preference was psychedelics. After reading about it, I decided to try DXM, which resulted in one of the worst experiences of my life. I misread the label. But being a fiend, I did it a few more times and noticed some really weird effects, like the next day after dosing, I would have intense flashbacks. They were pretty much different from the initial dose, way more trippy and visual. Sometimes these flashbacks would happen after 3 days from taking the DXM, and I would see patterns almost all the time. It was then when I stopped using DXM. I figured it was some kind of allergic reaction to DXM alone. I never heard of HPPD. So when I was offered 2CT7, I gladly accepted, and even though I had a wonderful time, my vision was fucked. I was seeing patterns for 4 days after. Now I had permatrips. I would be seeing patterns almost all the time, but I felt fairly normal up until I stupidly tried Datura. Even though it was a low dose, it made everything 5 times worse. Now on top of DXM visuals, I would see colored shadows of everything I looked at, and if I stared at something for a minute, it would start waving back and forth or up and down, mostly floors and walls. I'd also done E a couple times and gravel twice, but they didn't seem to affect me too badly. All this took place over 3 months, and I have since quit speed, coke, and DXM, and I'm never fucking touching Datura again, the most evil shit in the world. I quit because of a really bad cut coke experience which made me go fucking nuts for 3 days and caused me a lot of pain, rat poison. I almost died and vowed to respect my body and mind. I smoke a lot of pot, but that's about it, aside from one shroom trip, but my vision is still screwed, although the patterns have faded somewhat. I see lights out of the corners of my eyes and flies flying across the room, plus the moving walls and trails. Some days worse than others, but every day to some extent. Sometimes it makes me sad to think what it would be like not to be fucked in the head, but now, I'll never know unless by some miracle it goes away. Hopefully the stress of it all doesn't get to me before then. All I can really do is lay off drugs and try to live some kind of normal life. The only advice I can give is never, ever do Datura. And if you think you're susceptible to HPPD, stop doing the drug that is causing it, because it will only get worse with every dose. P.S. My carpet for some reason makes me hallucinate way more than anything else. I often catch myself staring into the shifting patterns for hours.